I reached for the last dinner fork as his hand came down hard on my shoulder. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies make violence look. No raised voices, no cinematic slam. It was small, a quick, sharp shove that knocked the chair from under me and sent a scatter of silverware clattering across the oak table. Gravy slapped the hem of my dress. A candle wavered. A hush grew like fog in the dining room. My stepfather laughed, the kind of laugh that asks other people to provide the punchline. My husband looked away as if he could shrink the whole moment by pretending it hadn't happened. My mother-in-law said something about being careful with the candle as she dabbed at the napkin. The rest of the house kept doing what houses do. Someone cleared a throat. Someone else tried to steer the conversation back to the safe shore of the weather and work and remembering dead men in polite ways. I did not scream. I did not cry. I slid my phone under the table and turned it on. My hand shook inside my lap. The skin at my knuckles went white. I put my face into a practiced, tranquil smile and let the red recording dot blink for 20 seconds until the flush faded and the tiny light went out. It all felt ridiculous and enormous at once. The shove itself was mild enough that later, the people who didn't want to see it would call it an accident. Clumsy. A misread of space. But it landed inside me like a verdict. Not because of the bruise it might make, not even knowing yet if there'd be a bruise, but because of the meaning behind the action. Someone deciding I did not matter enough to be treated decently, and doing so in front of other people to make the point. We finished the dinner. Small uneasy jokes filled the vacuum. My mother-in-law patted my hand and called me tenderly, as if wound tissue could be healed with a smile. My husband dutifully laughed at some old story about my father and shifted the mood. I played the clip in my head like a looping film I could not pause. After washing dishes by myself in the kitchen while the family lingered upstairs, I sat on the cold tile and listened to the recording again. That was when I heard the whisper. It was softer than the shove, but it was close and low in the way threats often are, meant only for the person who was already being pushed. "Don't make trouble," the voice said, "or you'll regret it." The words reframed everything. That little shove was a punctuation mark, and the whisper was the sentence. It was the thing people used to keep someone small. A promise of consequences dropped like a key into a lock. It was not just impoliteness or a family spat. It was, for the first time since my father's funeral, a deliberate attempt to take something from me. At my father's funeral, an exchange of papers felt oddly dry and final. He had been particular, both generous and careful, and before he died he spoke with a lawyer a few times. I remember the odd, domestic way he said some things as if he were sealing drawers. He'd always used the metaphor of safekeeping. He didn't make grand plans. He read the paperwork over carefully, asked quiet questions, and told me in a slow voice he used for instructions on how to operate a stubborn lawnmower, that he wanted to make sure people who cared for one another would be taken care of, but not those who took advantage. At the time, his will felt like the sort of thing you only speak about to show you had done your due diligence. Now, listening to the whisper that the shove had printed into my phone, I realized why he had been so specific. He had included a clause meant to protect me if certain things happened after he was gone. It was the sort of sentence you add to a contract when you suspect that trust is thin. That night I didn't call the police. I thought about it, then about what calling the police would mean. One more escalation in a house where I still had to sleep under the same roof as the people who could press a thumb to my shoulder and demand my silence. There was the small, cold calculus of safety and custody, and the way neighbors in the cul-de-sac liked everything to stay respectable. I had a son to consider. I had payrolls and the mortgage and a life that was dully complicated. Instead I recorded. Then I planned. When I told the lawyer, Hargrove, a man whose office smelled like lemon oil and old paper, the clip made him pull his glasses down to the tip of his nose and listen properly. He did not call me hysterical or suggest I was making a fuss. He slid a large file over the desk like he was offering me a chair. "Your father included a conditional clause in his will," he said, turning the page slowly. "It disinherits anyone who physically or verbally harms you after his death. But it requires proof or corroboration." He didn't want to leave money to manipulation disguised as family. He folded his hands and looked at me like someone who had been waiting for a reason to be useful. That clause was a small legal blade. Could work if it had teeth. It required evidence. It required me to show that harm had been done, and that the harm was not only intended but real. Hargrove's eyebrows, the way the skin at the corners of his eyes tightened when he was thinking of the next step, told me he had been waiting for a case he thought was worth making. I walked home with the file under my arm and a quiet, dangerous resolve in my chest. If there was a chance, a legal chance, that the will could be used as a shield, then I needed to thread my life through that opening carefully. Not to ruin people. To make sure no one used money as a weapon when it came to me and, more importantly, to our son. 2 weeks later the house was full again. A gathering that looked like a large family's idea of duty, half ritual, half performance. My mother-in-law had her pearls and a practiced smile. My stepfather was loud in a domestic, proprietorial way. My husband moved in the room like a man balancing a tray he was afraid to drop. His hands found mine at odd intervals and he would whisper, "I'm sorry," like a benediction or a plea. I learned that when you stand in a room full of other people's versions of the past, your own memory feels collated and small. I took up small, practical duties, folding napkins, answering a cousin's question about arriving times, making sure my son's juice cup was full. Inside I placed seats. An odd thing that felt like agency. I sat where I could see my mother-in-law's hands. I asked my husband softly if he would be careful. He said he would. He didn't stop his mother when it mattered later. The attorney opened the will with the kind of calm that draws a room's attention. When he reached the clause my father had insisted on, my stepfather lunged for the file so fast his whole body leaned forward. He muttered something about family privacy. In the arc of the motion, he knocked over a candle. A napkin took fire. For the first time the room had a real urgency. Guests clapped at the flame with napkins until someone stamped hard and put it out. And then I said one small thing aloud. "Play it." My voice felt thin, but it carried because people were already looking for answers. Hargrove pressed a button on his phone and the recording I had made months ago filled the air. A soft domestic voice, the scrape of a chair, and then the shove. The whisper followed next, low and intimate. "Don't make trouble or you'll regret it." You could see the way the recording rearranged people. My mother-in-law's skin drained of color first, then pulled tight like paper in the sun. My husband went pale. People shifted in their seats as if someone had opened a window and a draft moved through the room. The clip was small and unmistakable. With it came the phone screenshot I'd forwarded to Hargrove, the message from my husband to his mother. "We need to make this go away." When Hargrove played that, it was like adding a bracketed note to a sentence that had been half-heard for years. My mother-in-law's first move was rage. She grabbed my hand and called me liar, called me manipulative. She accused the attorney of colluding with me. A cousin leaned in to block my husband from lunging for my phone. I felt like I was standing in the eye of something that had been building for a long time. Evidence tends to do one thing. It turns speculation into a story you can point to. The private investigator I had hired on the advice of someone at work, someone who knew someone who could do discreet, found things that were maddening in their ordinariness. He came back with a photocopy of a ledger, hidden in a shoebox in the back of my stepfather's closet. The pages were full of cash withdrawals, entries that read like informal ledgers. Dates, names, short notes. My father's name appeared beside an entry of cash, dated the week his health declined. Another entry corresponded to the day before the dinner where I'd been shoved. The more we found, the less defensible the denials seemed. The PI traced transfers into a shell company that paid a small consulting fee labeled cryptically on one ledger. Small amounts moved in stages, the sort of thing that looks neat only if you don't look at the receipts. When Hargrove put the photocopies on the table at the next family meeting, you could feel the room tighten around the truth. People tried reactions in the order they came to mind. First denial, then counterattack. My mother-in-law called the recording fake, edited. She waved a notarized letter claiming my father had been confused when he made the will. Hargrove shrugged and said that argument was routine. People tried to attack the testator's capacities to unsettle the document. He asked me gently, had I kept everything? Had I saved the things my father had said in emails? Did we have witnesses who could attest to his coherence in those last days? I had a handful of things, yes. A small stack of emails where he had written worrying notes about how people around him seemed slippery. A short letter to Hargrove asking him to keep an eye on the estate. The nurse who'd been with him the week before he signed offering a written statement that he was of sound mind when he made his decisions. The nurse's written note would help. It would be boring and practical and exactly the sort of thing that follows a legal track. It would also mean the contesting side could try to fabricate new things. They did. The PI unearthed odd signatures and initials on some hospital release forms. They looked like my stepfather's handwriting but sloppier. Some dates didn't make sense. If they were forged, it meant the contest to invalidate the clause was built on lies. The PI also found an answering machine memo, an old device someone had kept in a garage, where my stepfather boasted about taking care of family matters and how nice it was when plans came together. We filed it with the attorney and the court as intent. And then the threats started: thin envelopes with coarse words, a wrecked porch light, a truck that idled by the curb outside more than once. A neighbor called to ask if they should be worried. I didn't want to tell anyone that I was, but the PI's reports made it official. Someone had been watching our house at odd hours. I asked my husband about the truck and he broke. He smelled like gasoline and had his hands jammed in his pockets. He said he'd met a man in the hardware store parking lot who offered to fix things for a price. He'd paid the man cash because he was afraid. He told me about money he'd moved into accounts tied to his mother, about how she pressured him in private calls. He showed me statements that looked like confessions. He was ashamed, a small man in front of the window of our life. He wanted to make it right. When a person you've loved shows you their worst mistake and asks to be allowed to fix it, you are taught to weigh quickly the cost and the possible gain. He offered to cooperate. He agreed to speak in court. We charted a path. He would be honest under oath. He would tell the truth about pressure and transfers in moments when he'd acted out of fear. In court he did. He sat on the stand and said the things that made him smaller and more real. The pressure, the strings pulled by his mother, the transfers he had made without reading documents carefully. He used the words you use when you offer up the truth as penance. I was afraid. I wish I had been stronger. He named people who'd been involved. Others in the family had to answer whether they'd been complicit by inattention or by active help. That kind of testimony breaks certain stories down. It does not make the world bright and simple, but it does open doors. My husband's testimony shifted the balance. The judge ordered investigations, subpoenas for bank records, and the freezing of assets. The shell company's trail, once traced, led to an offshore account that had been receiving transfers. A forensic accountant hired by Hargrove produced a report with the plainness of numbers, suspicious transfers, the timing of deposits, entries that matched the copies of the ledger we had found in the closet. Some family members buckled. A cousin admitted to signing papers without reading them. An aunt apologized in a small voice from across a courtroom. Others dug in. My mother-in-law refused to acknowledge anything beyond a personal slight. She accused me of wanting money and publicity. She called me entitled in a way that hurt because entitlement is one of the least useful things to be accused of when you've been trying to protect your child. Between court dates there were small fights about logistics, where our son would go when the hearings were scheduled, how public school would feel when cameras were near the courthouse. Someone suggested a private tutor to keep him out of the spotlight. The mother-in-law suggested it as if removing him from our lives was an act of mercy. My bones clenched. I did not want to teach my son, who liked pancakes and small jokes, how to be guarded in his own living room. There was a clause in the will, a practical, ugly nice clause that my father had put in that allowed an executor to petition for temporary guardianship of minors when estate matters created dispute. Hargrove explained it as the sort of thing people do to preserve children's stability during legal storms. I filed notice. I hated the system at that moment because it felt like a power grab in a house already full of them, but I also knew the reality. Family affairs have a habit of weaponizing children. I would resist that by taking steps that made it harder to use my son as leverage. The legal battle had a public face. A reporter found the video after a relative leaked it on social media. Within hours the clip had been shared widely. People I had not seen in years messaged me. Strangers offered advice and condolences. And there was a chorus of opinion that rolled through us like a surf. Media attention did strange things. It comforted and exposed us. Some neighbors said they were proud I had stood up to bullying. Others said the family ought to handle its matters privately. The church had difficult conversations. Letters arrived in the mailbox, some supportive, some vitriolic. I tried to keep the sound at arm's length because it was easy to let outrage pull you into a story you didn't mean to tell. In mediation, my mother-in-law made a strategic offer. A public apology, some money returned to the estate, and therapy. She wanted closure. I wanted truth and repair but not bought peace. I proposed a conditional reconciliation. Public apology, genuine counseling, and work supporting survivors, specifically reaching out to the woman whose husband years ago had been harmed by my stepfather. She refused the first time. She said she would rather go to trial. Some offers are tests, some are gestures. The mother-in-law's refusal told me where she was not willing to go. I left the mediation with the sense of someone who had stepped away from a bargain she thought too cheap for what had been done. The case moved in fits. An answering machine voice memo surfaced where my stepfather was bragging. A guard let slip that he'd heard stepfather ranting. The defense pressed the confused testator argument, claiming my father hadn't known what he was doing when he signed the clause, and produced a notarized statement to that effect. We found the hospice nurse who'd sat with him. She agreed to give a written account that the man she'd cared for had been coherent when he talked about his estate. The presence of a credible medical witness is useful in probate fights because judges don't like to overturn documents made by an apparently competent mind. Pieces came together in the slow, boring way of bureaucracy. Bank freezes, subpoenas, affidavits, depositions. The PI pulled more threads. The bank ledger, a pay stub or three. The way small deposits lined up in a pattern that suggested someone was siphoning and shuffling. Forensic accountants have a patient mind for paper. They can line up dates and amounts until the story they're going to tell is undeniable. That kind of evidence is blunt and ordinary. It is not cinematic. It is stackable. It is glue. It speaks in numbers and dates. It doesn't roar, it accumulates. We used it. Sometimes I think the most human thing I did was to keep doing obvious, competently boring actions, save emails, screenshot messages, pay the PI and the accountant and the lawyer. I made lists. I kept the child's schedule stable. I learned to ask questions of people whose eyes didn't meet mine. I practiced telling the same story in plain terms until my voice did not shake when I reached the parts that had once been unbearable. There were nights when I sat with the pixel glow of the laptop open to 100 messages and felt like I'd been unmoored. My son would come in, his hair in a mess, asking for pancakes, and I would stop being the woman in a headline and become simply the person who mixed batter too quickly and burned the bottoms but made him laugh anyway. When the judge's ruling came, after hearings where people cried and lawyers moved big stacks of paper across a mahogany table, he upheld my father's clause. The will was valid, the conditions stood. The judge's order was precise. Assets could be redistributed according to the terms when the harms were proved, and the court ordered further investigation into the transfers. My mother-in-law launched a final appeal. Her lawyer pressed the point that the clause was unfair and too controlling. Her appeals failed. Evidence and testimony had done the slow work. The ledger and the recordings, the nurse's statements and the uncle's admissions, joined with the math of bank transfers until the argument that this was all a frame seemed unviable. I stood in a courtroom and told the judge why I had waited to speak. I told him that I hadn't wanted to make my son's life a spectacle. I told him that if I had called the police that night at dinner, it would have been one more fight in a house already full of them, and I feared that would make everything worse for my child. I told him the truth. I needed time to assemble a case that would not only show harm but would fix things in a way that didn't simply displace money into new hands. The judge looked at me like people look at things when they finally understand why something small became so large. He read my father's moral line aloud. The estate was meant to benefit people who cared for each other, not those who used cruelty to take advantage. He signed orders that protected the assets until restitution and structural changes could be arranged. There was an appointed moment, practical and odd, when I had to make decisions as executor. It was bureaucratic and soul-heavy at once. I set up a trust for my son. I set up a survivor's fund. I wrote rules for how the money could be reclaimed by family if they met real conditions. Public apology, engagement in therapy, community work, and verified steps toward restitution. I did not want to act with wrath. I wanted to create a system that made re-entry into family life contingent on demonstrable change. Some people did that work. My husband agreed to remain in our marriage and to be honest in ways that felt new. He went to therapy. He volunteered for the Survivor Fund's outreach program. He sat across a table from me and spoke to the social worker assigned to our case with a humility that cost him dearly. He was not heroic. He was only finally ordinary. willing to do the work that relationships require when things crack. Others chose differently. The mother-in-law refused the conditions set for reconciliation and stormed out of mediations with a parting volley of threats. She called me unscrupulous and said I had turned a family's pain into public spectacle. The public, though, had a different reaction. When more documents and recordings surfaced and the numbers lined up on paper, sympathy swung. The people who had once defended her without knowing the receipts began to notice the math. After the case closed in earnest, papers filed, the appeals exhausted, we did the small thing that felt like an exhale. We took the boy to a park. He ran in a circle of other children and came back to me with a face bright as a coin, and I felt again the simple scale of life. The Survivor Fund launched with modest donations and community programs. We supported counseling, job training, and public education about how small abuses can become big thefts. I did not feel triumphant in a way that movies make triumphant feel. There was no cinematic music cue and no easy redemption. There was, though, a steady relief. I felt like a heat in my palm when I held our son's hand. There was a quiet satisfaction in the legal work finished, and in putting the money to work in a way that would help people who could not protect themselves the way my father had tried to protect me. The hardest thing was not the courtroom or the papers. It was the intimate, daily smallness of starting again. Learning to trust the things that are ordinary, like a dinner that doesn't include the small violence of editorializing about someone's worth. It was learning to speak up quick and clear when small slights happened again, to teach my son that a shove is not something you carry silently, to let him see the difference between protection and scorekeeping. Sometimes, in the low hum of our new routine, I think about why I stayed quiet the night of the shove. The easier truth would be to call it cowardice. The fuller truth is messier. I stayed because I had reasons that made sense in the life I had. Fear for my child, the slow accrual of grief, and a father's careful paper trail. I stayed because I believed I could do something that would not only stop it but would make a course correction for people who used money and position to crush others. People asked later whether I regretted the silence. Some said I should have spoken then and there, that the clean moral thing would have been to name the moment immediately and call the police. I answered as honestly as I could. If you told me in that first stunned second that everything would work out in the end, and work out meant that people would be held accountable and steps would be taken to prevent future harm, then I might have said yes. But life doesn't hand you those guarantees. You have to build evidence and keep your child safe while you do it. My father, who had always been small and patient with screws and engines, had put down more than money. He had left instruction about how to treat people and what to do when people broke that code. He had measured out terms and left them in a document. He had willed me the standing tools to make a defense that was not solely about money but about the rightness of care. So I used those tools. I used the recordings, the receipts, the nurse's notes, my husband's late confession, the PI's reports. I used the slow durability of the law to hold the space needed for truth to become common knowledge. There were costs. There always are. Family ties were damaged in ways that might never be fully repaired. A mother-in-law's face that once showed soft approval now looks at me like a stranger might. But there were also repairs. Some relatives who had quietly suspected for years reached out and said they were sorry they hadn't listened sooner. Neighbors stopped assuming the neat facade of the household meant everything was fine. People I had not seen since college sent messages with internet hugs and notes that were practical and human. What can we do to help? This perhaps was the second kind of luck we needed. On a Saturday morning, months after the rulings, I stood in the kitchen and watched my son pancake batter into the pan with a proud mess on his small face. The man I married again in the quiet way two people choose to keep building together, stood at the sink and rinsed cups. There were no cameras. There was no lawyer. There was only the low sound of the neighborhood waking up and the small, obvious fact that someone had to make breakfast. Sometimes justice looks like a courtroom. Sometimes it looks like a weekend morning where a child is safe, and a man is willing to learn to be steady. My father's claws held. The will had teeth. The money was used to build something that might help others in the future, not out of vengeance but out of the expectation that families should protect, not prey upon one another. The mother-in-law keeps going her own way. She is, from a distance, still part of my son's life in the technical sense, but the parameters are clear. If she wants reconciliation, she must do the work. I am not eager to punish for the pleasure of revenge. I want to see real change. If she asks the right way and does the right thing, there is a path. If she chooses anger, there will be consequences set by legal bindings and by the social reality that comes from being visible in the world. I did something that night when I let the recording sit on my phone and blink its small red dot. I let it rest. I put it into a plan. I stayed quiet then because I needed strength that night to become evidence and later to become accountability. That is both a selfish and selfless thing. A mother's anxiety combined with a daughter's stubbornness. It is not heroic. It is simply how one person navigates a difficult moral and practical landscape. The fights aren't over. There will be appeals to character, social media conversations that spin away from facts, and people who will always remember the scene as something other than harm. I have learned in the course of this ugly affordance of kin and law to hold two things at once: the ache of relations that break and the practical need to make sure the next family cannot be harmed in the same way. My son grows in a house that is quieter about pretense and louder about boundaries. He sees his father going to meetings and apologizing without theatrical gestures. He sees me file forms and call accountants and school administrators. He sees us both try, in small domestic ways, to be ordinary. He knows pancakes are sometimes burned, and sometimes they are perfect. He knows that when someone shoves and whispers, it should not be allowed to stand. In the end, the world we chose kept some of what matters. We did not get everything, no one ever does. But we kept our boy and used what my father left to make sure our lives were less vulnerable to petty cruelty wrapped in the armor of family and money. That is not a perfect ending. It is a beginning with a more honest foundation. It is a house where someone learned to say, quietly but clearly, no more. I think my father would have liked that nuance. He always liked simple repairs and clean tools. He would have appreciated that I had used the tools he left behind to build something that might keep us safer. And on Saturday mornings, when the batter hits the pan and my son laughs at his own clumsy flips, that is perhaps the best evidence that I've done enough for now. We keep the recording stored in a secure folder, not to gloat but to remember what catalyzed the change. It is evidence and memory both. It reminds me of the shove and the whisper, and of the chain of small steady actions that turned a single moment into a case for justice instead of simply a family story. We are not finished learning, but we are moving forward in a house that remembers how to be kind and how to be honest. And for now, that is a good place to be.